Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining. We are going to wait just a few moments here, and then we will get started. Thank you all for being here. We're looking forward to today's conversation that is born out of the most recent publication of Forward, the Public Art Now section within there, which was guest curated by Jessica Mehta. And we will have a conversation between Jessica and artist Gregg Deal today. I'm going to be kind of hosting, and then I'll disappear and I'll hand things over to Jessica. But I am Mallory Roxana Nizam. I am the curator of partnerships and programming for Forward, the publication by Forecast Public Art. And we are just so happy to have these two brilliant artists here and all of you tuning in today. I'm going to share just a little bit about who Forecast is, who is hosting today. Next slide. The Forecast is a nonprofit based out of the Twin Cities, but I myself today am calling in from St. Louis, Missouri, which is the unceded land of the Miami, Osage, Quapaw, Kickapoo, Kaskaskia, and others. And we know that all public art is on Indigenous land. And the next slide shows you where Forecast works, which is all around the country. But Forecast Public Arts offices themselves, as I mentioned, are in the Twin Cities, and that office resides on the land cared for and called home by the Dakota, Sioux, Ojibwe, and other Native peoples from time immemorial in current day St. Paul. And we urge all of you who are tuning in today to consider the land on which you live and all the converging legacies that bring you to stand or sit wherever you are today, and encourage especially those of us working in public art and making public art to really be thinking about this in our work. Next slide. Forecast has a really great team. I am one of them. There are many that help to support public art all around the country. And Forecast, again, is a nonprofit, but also has a consulting practice as well. Next slide. Forecast does 5 main things. Again, it's sort of a myriad of granting and support services and training for those interested in growing their public art practice, with focus on supporting Black, Indigenous, and people of color who are working in the public arts space, and then also a consulting practice to help others grow that work around the country. Next slide. In Forecast's creative studio, Forecast helps to expand access to tools, resources, and opportunities for artists. Next slide. In planning.
Q&A.
Sorry?
There's something in the chat. I think maybe the slides aren't showing.
Oh, the slides are not showing. Okay. Well, if the slides are not showing, I apologize for that. I'm gonna work as if you cannot see the slides. So let's just go as if we cannot see the slides. So actually, Jen, why don't you just take them down? Thank you. And I just wanted to share with you all that Jessica curated this really beautiful collection of public art now, which I was going to show you a few images from. But I think since we can't look at those images, I'd rather just have Jessica and Gregg kind of talk about public art now from their perspective and have a discussion about that very topic. And we're going to put a link in the chat for you to just take a look at the projects and artists that Jessica features. And one of them is Gregg. I'll just share a little bit about these two folks, and then I'll hand it over to Jessica. So Jessica Mehta is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, Two-Spirit, full-time working artist, writer, and researcher, many things. Jessica has a writing company called Metaphor, which was founded in 2012 and was recently a 2021 Lean Portland artist, and created a series of works titled Strong Found Nations, which brings attention to the history of the Indian boarding schools, of which her father was a survivor. And as a Native artist, she knows firsthand the depths and intricacies of systemic racism within the world of, quote, Western art, and particularly in settler-based spaces like major art galleries and museums. Jessica is also a Fulbright Nehru Scholar, senior scholar in Bengaluru, where she is teaching poetry workshops at Christ University and curating an anthology of contemporary Indian poetry written in the colonizer's tongue, which I would love to read at some point, Jessica. Jessica is also Forecast's current Change Lab research fellow, and there she's focusing on Indigenous visibility in public art, and she's examining the language used in open calls for Native American public artists. So welcome, Jessica. And then Gregg Deal. Gregg, if you could just wave, let folks know who you are. Is from the Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that. Gregg, and is a multidisciplinary artist, activist, and disruptor. And his work is informed by his Native identity and includes exhaustive critiques of American society, politics, popular culture, and history. Through Gregg's paintings, murals, performance, filmmaking, spoken word, so many mediums, he brings the viewer in to confront these issues in both the present and the past. Gregg has a 2018 TED Talk, and just let us know that there's another TED Talk that just came out, I think yesterday or very recently. And in those talks is talking more about accurate representations of Indigenous people in public art. And we're going to hear a lot more about that and all that these two folks do today. So I will hand it over to Jessica to get us going.
Wado Mallory, Osio, everyone. Jessica Meredagwodowa, Jija Legi. And hello, Gregg. We have just met kind of face to face for the first time a few minutes ago. So I told Gregg, I told you that I've spent the past couple of weeks just watching absolutely everything that I could find on YouTube that features you, and then missed this recent TED Talk, which is so unfortunate because all I do is watch YouTube in the morning while I'm working out. But I discovered some things in the videos. We have a few overlapping similarities. I know you mentioned that you are also Cherokee. So we share that background, and we both spent some time in DC, although you were there much longer than I was. I was there for 9 months, 2018-19. It's obviously an interesting place to be Native and an artist. Can we start by just sharing your experience in the so-called nation's capital?
Sure. I don't think I've ever said I was Cherokee. I might have talked about my father's from the South. And as you know, there are a myriad of blood myths that come out of the South, particularly after Reconstruction during the Civil War. And that was true for my white father. They believed that they were and found out that they weren't, and it happens. So yeah, and DC, of course, is part of that. They're below the Mason-Dixon line, so I think that feeds into my experience as well. Almost 17 years in Washington D.C. and just constantly having people talk about these blood myths, which of course was tied also to a national sports team that's using a racial slur. And also the way that I think Washington, D.C., particularly in its public art practice, is overwhelmingly colonial. And there's a lot of stories that go into that are really interesting and really problematic. And I heard a story once that there were these statues on the steps of the Capitol of a colonialist, like with I think they were stepping on the heads of natives in the sculpture, and so there's this history that's there that is both ignored in plain sight and also just like kind of silently been removed, so those things aren't really there. And then of course there's a Native person on the Capitol building as well. I think that her name was Liberty or something along those lines. And when I worked at the National Museum of American Indians, right out of college during its inaugural year opening, we had all that information of like who that was on the Capitol building, which we could see from the building. So yeah, DC's a weird place. It's a really strange place.
So how, can you talk a little more? What is your, I guess, personal and arts-based process of decolonizing? And how are you like shedding or working towards shedding certain aspects of your background? Because we also both share, a very Western colonial higher education training as well.
Yeah. I think, it's been a journey. I didn't grow up on my community, and have since, I'm connected there. We have family, obviously, that's on Pyramid Lake on our reservations. And so I think my learning experience has been very much rooted in the political, which is also cultural in its own way. The understanding of history, which is also cultural in a lot of ways, and understanding civil rights movements and how those things work. And then coming into a public space, and having any sort of public persona within my work, means that I have to also learn, because I'm going to be on other people's homelands. I'm working in other people's spaces, sharing ideas in different spaces as well. And learning that while we try to push for the recognition and space of Native people on this, our homelands, that as Native people, we have to navigate the same space, that when we go into somebody else's homelands, that we need to recognize those things as well. In fact, we should be doing that, immediately, if we are truly in understanding of our place amidst other people's very specific homelands. And we're in this space, where we generalize, that all of North America is Indian country. But we're starting to really, I think, as Native people and myself, I'm beginning to think on more of a macro level, like specifically whose land am I on? Specifically, what language is that? Specifically, what is this space called? What is this mountain called? And how do I traverse that in a good way? Which is a different decolonization, but one that I think is incredibly important. As we come to understand, language and words and stories and spaces and history. And so we're, as a Native person, I'm thinking of all of those things at the same time. I'm not great at it, but I do my very, very best, because the colonial machine is a tough one to shake off.
Yeah, I can relate to that. I did not grow up on my ancestral homelands either, North Carolina or Oklahoma. So yeah, I mean, navigating the Indigenous diaspora is a lifelong process, for sure.
Yeah, I love your use of words. Some good big words.
Thank you. That's what a PhD in English gets you.
That's awesome.
Which I got in England, which was interesting choice. And
experience. That
yeah.
Sounds interesting. I want to hear about that. What is it like being a Native person on a colonist continental space?
I was the only one in the entire department. That's for sure. So it was good and bad and everything in between. And I had an amazing supervisor, so that made it worth it. But I wasn't studying anything related to indigeneity. So that was a factor.
Understood.
Yeah. So I know that two of the titles that you claim quite a bit are activist and disruptor. So I'm curious what you would say the similarities and differences are between those two.
I don't claim activist. I think at the beginning I did, because I was at the forefront, as many people were, of the mascot debate Washington, D.C. and nationally, I reached a point through that process in realizing that an activist within the English context of what that word means is not just changing, but also is being consumed. So I'm really I'm hesitant to claim activism. That's where the disruption came into place, and recognizing that an activist really is like an adult with an opinion, and it really just depends on who has the microphone. But I am in a constant state of disrupting. I think from a Native standpoint, an activist is somebody that works for the people, that serves the people. I think a lot of activists, not just in Indian country, but sort of throughout, are really struggling to find a balance of serving people while also participating in capitalism, because there has to be some sort of monetary gain in order to survive. But I know among our communities that, you know, activists are like fighters for the people. And I think it's really hard to balance the sort of benevolent action of serving people while trying to survive amidst the power structures that we live in. And so I reject it in so much as, like, I accept it when it comes up, but I reject it in terms of recognizing that I am not in a position financially to truly and honestly serve the people in the benevolent way that I should. But I can disrupt spaces. I can use my practice to disrupt spaces. I can use my voice to disrupt spaces. I can create problems, and all of it dovetails really nice into the teenage version of myself that was doing that stuff anyways. And so I've sort of adopted that into the vernacular of, I suppose, my description. And that's, I think those things end up being separate as a result, kind of separate. They're mildly related.
I just had to like look up the definition of disrupt to see like the breakdown, because, you know, there's so much focus right now on disease means dis-ease. But this is like a geeky linguist thing that I'll have to dig into more later. Interrupt is this. And I mean, we know what it means, but we don't know what it means, you know? So
Yeah.
what, if you had to, like, putting you on the spot, choose 5 titles right now that define you best, what would those be? Since activist is no longer part of that.
Husband, father, family always comes first. It's integrated into my work, and you've seen enough of my talks that it comes up constantly. Artist, and I think Numu, which is the word we use for what we call ourselves. Paiutes call ourselves Numu, and which means the people. And yeah, and disruptor. I think that all makes the most sense. Those things are constantly, I mean, if I send you a bio, those things are all going to be in there.
Yeah, I have some questions about integrating your family into your work, but I want to like stick with disruption for just a little bit longer. Sure. Because so I saw a little bit, obviously, of the work, The Last American Indian on Earth, and for attendees, that's where you dressed up in a, you know, fake Indian costume. So can you share just some of the most memorable interactions or happenings that you experienced? I know one of the clips I saw, a woman came up to you, and I think she asked, "What tribe are you from?"
Yeah.
And I couldn't tell if she was being genuinely curious, or because I kind of got the vibe that she was like about to call you out. Yeah.
No, totally. And really, you know, when you're filming something, it's really difficult. Sound is a really difficult thing when you're interacting with people who are not sort of in on what's going on. And so really you can only capture the sound that, you know, that is on my person. And if we're next to each other and we're talking to each other, I can capture the audio of that. And she ended up being somebody that engaged me so personally that I was able to sort of capture that sound. But I also sort of look at that engagement in the short film, The Last American Indian on Earth, as representing sort of an overarching experience of how people would interact with me. The constant questioning, and the questioning oftentimes comes to the perception of our existence and not the reality of our existence. And that perception has been fed by media and by film and books and the way that we've sort of been, and I'll use air quotes, allowed to enter in spaces with our identity, and how limited, incredibly limited that is, and how rooted in stereotypes those things are. And so her interaction ends up being the culmination of all of those things: the stereotypes, the limited understanding, blood myths that she's talking about in her own family, which exist in a lot of non-native, particularly white and some African-American experiences. And so that interaction ended up really being about all of those things, where it started with self-righteous indignation and wanting to call me out, because we were right at, when we shot that, was kind of at the precipice of a social understanding that, like, there were people wearing headdresses and things to major media festivals and concerts and things, without any sort of context or right to those things. And so it was all coming out of that. It was kind of an interesting interaction in that way. With that piece, which was in 2013, I mean, there was an instance where I was walking to the Lincoln Memorial. There's this weird long stretch. There's this road that kind of goes halfway around the Lincoln Memorial. And so there's this long sidewalk that goes next to it. And it's a one-way road, and this minivan pulled up next to me, and it was filled. Every seat in that minivan was filled, and they rolled all the windows down, and they all started doing the Hollywood, hand over the mouth thing at the same time. And I couldn't capture the audio of it because it just would have been, it was just so blatant and just brazen. And that stuff like that happens all the time, like The Last American Indian on Earth is just such a hyper realized concept of like a perception of being native in perceived regalia, exploiting the fact that native people or that non-native people don't understand what's real and what isn't when it comes to us and our identity, while simultaneously just like watching how just brazen Americans are within this understanding, and how willing they are to put themselves in a really, really bad light in the way that they engage Native people, which I think any Native person, if you go to a powwow and like you don't want to eat fry bread and you want to go to Chipotle next door, you're not going to change out of your regalia. You're just going to go. And so any person would have that experience. But that piece specifically was sort of like happening every day. And recognizing that Americans will rise to the occasion on that very specific issue. Yeah, I think a lot of the interactions that come to mind really are rooted in that original person we're talking about, that the perception of our existence, not the reality of our existence, which is rooted in stereotype and misunderstanding. And also misunderstanding of history, which I think plays a really big role in trying to traverse our representation post Black Lives Matter 2020, and trying to help people understand what all that means. And it's a lot. And it's really hard because there is no true context to that, because the education is lacking.
It's kind of unfortunate to say, but that would have been such, good audio, the van full of people, if you had been able to capture it. But
yeah.
Just have to go back and say, sorry, can you be ignorant like that again? I didn't quite get that,
Yeah.
It's not going to be the same.
But if you watch that film too, you can tell there's some moments where I'm like kind of messing with people a little bit.
Yeah.
And there was actually a lot more of that happening than what was shown. Yeah, and which speaks to the humor that we carry with us everywhere. A
Mhm.
survival tool in which we absolutely 100% mess with everybody in some way or another.
Yeah. So I obviously know a little bit about how or the outcome of your family and especially your children in your work. I mean, obviously your daughter was the model for the mural, which is the highlight, for the Forecast project. And then your son also cut his hair along with you, right? For that the installation
Yeah.
piece, the braid. Yeah. So can you talk about that process of did you approach him about it? Did you have, if you're willing to speak to it, have any
Yeah.
rituals about mourning and grief and how the concept of death shaped that?
Yeah. So Sage is my oldest. Sage came out uh, last year or so as non-binary. Phoenix is just turned 14, and they're two of five. We have five kids, which is like having a million kids. And Yeah, so my father died in 2015, and he actually asked me not to cut my hair, and I didn't. And it was really interesting to do that, because there is that process of mourning and sort of letting go of certain things and starting anew. And I held on to it for a long time, and I did this bike ride from Lake Tahoe to Pyramid Lake, which was following the waterways that go from Lake Tahoe into Pyramid Lake, and how those waterways are sort of these life-giving spaces, and how they also connect us to all of the communities that are up in the Sierras, all the way down into the desert, of Nevada outside of Reno. And after doing that, and after a lot of different things that were going on, I felt like it was time to sort of let go, of starting with my father, like all the way through these processes, and just sort of allowing myself to start anew. And while that was happening, I was also thinking through, as an artist does, like, what can I do with this? What can I, and I was thinking about like the summer that I had done that bike ride, that they had found a grave site next to the Stewart Indian School, that my grandparents went to, and they had found a mass grave of I think about 200 young bodies. And so I was thinking through all of those things, and so as this discussion about the boarding schools was starting to become a bigger issue, starting in Canada, and Americans are really good at pointing fingers, and not taking responsibility for what's actually happening here. And then of course, Deb Haaland, the Secretary of the Department of the Interior, is also launching this investigation. I was thinking about boarding schools and like how all of those things come together, and how to represent that in a way that's not too on the nose. And so it's interesting because like everything that's happening in my life is sort of all touching each other. And so I cut the hair for an unrelated reason, but decided that I would use the hair for this sculpture. And then when I did that, I started having the discussion with Phoenix, whose hair was probably just below his shoulders. And he was, he's in middle school, and kids are mean. And so we were having this discussion about what he looks like and what he does. And I was telling him about why I cut my hair and what was going through that process. And then he just sort of expressed that he wanted to do the same thing. He wanted to do this with me. And he did that. And then Stage caught wind of that, sort of also in the middle of sort of embracing their non-binary situation, also cut their hair. And so I have their hair, and have used it to integrate it into these works. because I think an impactful aspect of a sculpture about boarding schools is also leaving a piece of ourselves and leaving a piece of ourselves in that space, because being forced to leave a piece of yourself was part of the boarding school experience, whether that's your spirit or your physical self or your hair or, skin or however you want to phrase it. And so that became part of the process. I'm it for our household. Like I'm the breadwinner, as it were. And so the discussions that we have in my household are really integrated into being an artist. And so my kids are seeing, my youngest is 6, actually just turned 7. So she's seeing everything. My youngest is seeing everything as much as my oldest are seeing everything. And so those discussions are already sort of primed and ready to go as they happen. And they end up being part of it. And Sage wants to be an artist. So I've had a chance to really pull them into a lot of work, from helping me with murals, to being the subject matter of murals, to actually participating even in public performance pieces. Sage and I have been able to do that a few times as well. And so it's all kind of part of the family thing. It's something that we all do. And I recognize that the way my children see the world is totally different than the way I see the world, in terms of their experience as enrolled members of our tribal community, because they look different, because they have access to more representation than I did. And so all of those things end up changing, I think, the narrative. And so I'm trying to move forward in a way that is thinking about not just my experience, but also theirs as well. That was a lot, sorry.
What was the first thing that I'm assuming your oldest child like actively helped you with in terms of art? My kids just turned 6 and 7. They're adopted from the Oglala Lakota Nation. And for those who don't know, legally, most of the time, only tribally enrolled natives can adopt tribally enrolled children. And the disparate number of Native kids in foster care is related to residential. I mean, it's related to colonization. But for me, I have to learn, I'm not Lakota, I have to learn an entire other history as well. But when they were 5 and 6, I had them help me with like putting red handprints on some pieces. They obviously don't get it yet at this age, but yeah, I mean, like I'm trying to prioritize making them as involved as they want to be in these processes.
Yeah, I've done a few little things here and there. Before Sage came out as non-binary, even at that point, like we were still, I was still pulling them into things, and recognizing that that Sage is, the first of 5 of the most important Native people in my life. And which is not to say that my mom isn't important, because obviously she is, but I'm beholden to these children in a way that's just different. And so that's been part of what I've tried to connect with. As Sage started watching me and deciding that this is what they wanted to do, then I sort of use that as a catalyst to be like, well, cool, let's go do this and let's go do that. And the first thing that I consciously brought Sage into was a mural in Denver. Sage would have been, I think, about 12 or 13 years old. And it was the first time that they saw me working as sort of a muralist, and me just trying to give them an opportunity to paint a little bit and to try it out and to see how some of this stuff works. And that was meant to be sort of a starting point, and it absolutely was. Like Sage, the mural, the sort of missing and murdered Indigenous relatives mural, that Sage is the figure for, Sage painted like half of that, the bottom half of that mural. And so they've come to know my processes and how I work through these things. But there's another aspect to it. On that mural, there was a lot of media attention. It's 80 feet tall. It's in Colorado Springs. It's in arguably one of the top most politically conservative cities in the country. And there is an Indigenous child 80 feet tall in the middle of downtown Colorado Springs. So the media comes out and they want to do interviews and everything. And I had prepped Sage for that in so much as just saying, this is going to happen. They're going to want to talk to you, decide what you want to, if you want to talk or not. And Sage said, yeah. And so it wasn't just making and sort of participating and helping and assisting me with the mural. Yeah, Sage was on camera talking about representation as like a 14-year-old, which I just was sort of blown away by all the conversations we've been having for the whole of their life up to that point, sort of all came out in the sharp and very articulate way that Sage was able to just express why representation is important everywhere, not just in Colorado Springs. And so I think that ends up being a part of it too, because we end up usually having to be the experts in the room oftentimes, and watching Sage come into that in that way was pretty incredible, because it is part of the work. You have to understand what we're doing, how you're doing it. If there's history attached to it, you need to understand that history, all the way down to the dates and to the figures and the times. And yeah, Sage is super good about that. Now, as a 16, almost 17-year-old, yeah, Sage is a formidable voice, and I'm often just tickled by it. I'll just stand in the corner and just kind of like, yeah, go, please, because it's really awesome watching our youth kind of take the reins.
Something I'm looking forward to.
Yeah, no, it's so satisfying. I'm not gonna lie, but also like Sage is and maybe I'm generalizing, but my experience so far is that girls or someone who is girl passing, that there is a different stream of thought there than the boys, because all the boys are like cavemen. So Phoenix is 14, he's very smart, but I don't know how much he's thinking beyond video games and Legos. And so that's a whole thing too. So it'll be interesting to see how that sort of manifests itself with him.
So when we're talking about kind of unusual materials like your hair, and I love using like hyper organic materials, that kind of segues into what other materials have you worked with or are planning to work with that might surprise you? And I was, obviously, because I'm a writer, I was really drawn to the fact that when you put up the teepee and there was the bookcase inside of it, there was the fiction and nonfiction book sections, and those little kind of, so I love that, obviously. But it seems like you work with so many different stuff. So is there anything else coming up that you're thinking about?
Yeah, I went to school for painting, and obviously use all these different mediums, both for practical reasons and for impractical reasons. It's a funny thing about being an artist is when you build up enough of a reputation, you can just decide to try another medium and nobody really questions it. When you enter into the realm of being an artist, it's almost like you're pigeonholed into something, and then as that reputation grows, you can sort of expand that. It's a weird thing. I've been thinking a lot about spoken word and written word, but I've also been thinking a lot about the earth, and I have some wood pieces that I'm working on that are meant to create textures on canvas, or on like a wood panel, not unlike I think George Morrison did a lot of stuff like that was very sort of earthy in that way. But I've also been thinking, I have a lot of friends, or have made a lot of friends over the last couple of years that are doing environmental work within their artistic practice, and thinking about like what that looks like and how sort of just exciting it is to thinking through those processes and to be able to hold earth in your hands and how you can take this and you can use it for something, and then also how it's temporary. A gust of wind, the seasons go by and that thing can disappear. And the temporary nature of that, I think, is really beautiful. Using paint and canvases and for murals, I use spray paint, which is not very environmentally friendly at all. It's this exercise of trying to figure out ways to articulate stories and ideas through other mediums that make sense to me. I've been concentrating a lot on textiles, the textiles from my homelands, and converting those textiles into two-dimensional forms or into other types of textile patterns. And I've been thinking a lot about storytelling and how could I tell a story using visual art? How could I create a storyline that makes sense to me? And so I'm beginning to work in this space that is using essentially a large frame, let's say 5 feet by 8 feet frame, and putting things inside the frame that are different, things that are earthbound, things that look traditional, things that are more part of the artistic practices of printmaking and painting, and being able to create stories within that, so that it's like using earth and stories and ideas that all sort of mesh together, but that also I think are accessible in terms of texture and visuals and ideas. And so I've been moving towards that direction as well, and trying to figure out ways to do works outside beyond murals. I have a piece that's related to the sculpture of chairs that's titled "The Space Where Spirits Get Eaten," which is from an old John Trudell quote, "Protect your spirit because you're in the place where spirits get eaten." Doing another boarding school piece that's like outside and like essentially digging a 6-foot pit and lining it with chairs inside that space, and then being able to bring Native adults to interact with that space, and like, what does that look like and what does it mean? And it's sort of kind of touching on mass graves and boarding schools, but it's also earth, and it's also like these chairs which are wood, but they're also manufactured somehow. And I think that there's something kind of incredible that touches on the fact that we live in a world of industry and manufacturing while simultaneously living on the earth, where there's ground and there's trees and there's grass and there's rocks and there's animals, and recognizing that all of those things are in the same place. So you've caught me in a good moment. I'm actually really, I don't know that I've really done much of that in my practice, but I am wholeheartedly in that space right now, and trying to figure out what that looks like and what that feels like. And I'm thinking about something really simple. When my kids were really little, we were going to a powwow, and we were walking in. We had to park in this dirt parking lot, and we're walking on the dirt parking lot, and it's bumpy and there's potholes, and it's kind of a pain to walk on. And one of my kids is like, this is really hard to walk on. Like, why they should just pave this and like turn it into a parking lot. And I said something to the effect of that we spend more time walking on concrete and asphalt, which separates us from the earth, than we do walking in bare feet in the grass and on the ground. Like, we need to feel the earth beneath our feet. We need to be able to feel the dirt coming up into the ground, because that is our connection. And there's these man-made elements that separate us from that, which is, I think, strange and maybe mentally for me is really scary to be in spaces like that. I remember the first time I went to Brooklyn, New York, and I was just like terrified by how separated it was from the rest of like the earth, from the ground, from the things that are there. Which is not to judge, folks that are there, but just how different of an experience that is to grow up in a space like that. And so, yeah, I've been thinking within those terms, I've been thinking about like work that I'm working on right now.
Yeah, my kids are always like the only ones bare feet in the grass, but it's me telling them like take off your shoes. And all the other kids, none of them are native, like neighborhood kids, are like, oh, you might get a splinter. I'm like, you'll live. But yeah, I trekked Everest Base Camp in September, and like all different kinds of people go trekking. And a lot of the like older folks, I routinely overheard complaints that this should be paved because it's such a tour. I'm like, you want to pave the Himalayas? Okay. I think I just have time for one more official question, but it's a good segue. So talking about materials, I know you and I spoke very briefly before this started about your new TED Talk, and I asked if you had really just bought corpse tags, and I'm just going to pop this in the chat as well. I don't know, this is officially out there. I don't know how much you want to talk about what that project is.
Yeah, well, in that TED Talk, I'm actually talking about some new works, which includes the sculpture that we were just talking about. And I have a tendency to take like historical artifacts and try to incorporate them into the work. I have this idea that when you learn about things sitting in a classroom, when you watch a film, when you're listening to talking points on, the news, we're getting information in a way that is sort of the same. And so it's easy for us to gloss over it. And I think art and film and literature and writing and poetry and performance and like all these things create a medium that allows us to hear and see things that are in a different way, so that we can actually ingest it in a different way, that we can see it with different eyes. And so I found out about these corpse tags in November of 2021. Pretty well versed in history and had never heard of this. I did a Google search and found some for sale on eBay. Corpse tags were used specifically for bounty hunting during westward expansion, where bounty hunters could go out and they could murder native people and get money out of it. These corpse tags were used to sort of identify their bodies. It says on their Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is part of the Department of the Interior, but in the 1800s was part of the War Department. And it also says property of U.S. government. These brass tags are just willy-nilly for sale on eBay. So I created a triptych using corpse tags. I actually have one here. Using a corpse tag on each side of the triptych. And then in the center one are some handcuffs from the mid 1800s with a corpse tag hanging from the middle of it. These ones are Wyoming Territory corpse tags. And then the ones on the handcuff are actually from Standing Rock. The Plains Indians sort of really facing the brunt of that westward expansion and the bounties that were being placed on the heads of Native people. And yeah, I didn't really dress it up. They're there mounted on these wood panels. And they're meant to be disturbing. They're meant to be something that is that people don't know about. They're meant to be confrontational. And I think that especially now, as we are sort of entering into this weird space of censoring history, which doesn't make any sense, except that history's sort of always been censored, at least omitted sensory, that we're entering into a space where we're losing opportunity to really understand the ramifications of history and what that means. And so that work is meant to be sort of confrontational in a like, did you know, sort of statement. The TED Talk really just talks about that and gives some context to it, specifically to, the German effort to eliminate Jewish people. And then the UN and the Geneva Convention's definition of genocide, which has 5 different tenets attached to it. And the United States engagement of Native people fits all 5 of those very clearly. And so, yeah, that's another part of it, is sort of integrating historical ideas into the work from time to time, which, believe it or not, I try to softball things and it just never works. And so sometimes I try to pull back, and then I find these things and it's just like, I have to get them out there. I can't buy these and hold on to them. They have to go out. And that work, like, I would obviously never sell that work. I would donate it long before I would ever sell work like that. But I'm not even sure if I would do that. Yeah, it's a really interesting space to be in as a Native person, and recognizing that there are artifacts denoting our demise that are for sale on eBay that you can just buy. And like, who would buy that? I obviously have a vested interest, but like, who would buy that? That's just so weird.
I think I need to hand it over to Mallory now. And I know there's a few questions in the Q&A box down there.
Wow, thank you so much. We have a lot of great questions, and we're not going to be able to answer them all, but I do want to kick it off with a question from Miranda Kyle, which is about land. And this question is about the LANDBACK movement and its relationship to public art. So Miranda asks, can you speak to intersecting practices or methodologies that you employ at the crossroads of the LANDBACK movement and public art?
Yeah. Hi, Miranda. Yeah. I'm sort of in a space of like, LANDBACK, I think, is such an important movement. But I also believe, or at least understand, that the lack of context that your average American citizen has to Native people, and what something like a LANDBACK movement might look like, or why it would be happening at all, needs to first happen under the understanding that you're on Native land. And institutions, like higher education institutions, organizations like this one, are recognizing those things. But I think, your average working class, middle of the country white person might have a difficult time understanding that. So I have a project right now that I'm working on, in addition to like these public murals and things, called the Indigenous Sign Initiative, where I've created signs that look like parking signs, that are essentially saying that you are on Indigenous land. It's also an art installation in terms of like recognizing that there's some people that are going to be mad about this. So there's a real phone number that people can call and air their grievances on, and just sort of collecting that information while simultaneously creating something that can exist in plain sight. I think there's a lot of good organizations doing some incredible things along these lines. The Indian Collective, Illuminative, being a couple that I would point out in terms of LANDBACK, and also just sort of overall recognition of Native representation. But I'm kind of picking at things and picking at people and picking at space. Disrupting is what I've been doing. So right now, that's something I'm working on. Murals, I think, also play a part in that, but murals tend to be in big city areas, which means that there is an element of progression socially, if not politically, oftentimes, that allow those things to exist there. I'm interested in like taking things like these signs and putting them up in, like Provo, Utah, and just like really sort of upsetting those spaces. That's something I'm doing, but there are efforts to actually procure land. If I could figure out a way to do that, I would love to do that. Nicholas Gallinen is another artist that did a huge piece in Malibu, California, a big or a big Indian land sign that is sort of modeled after the Hollywood sign. And he used that to raise money to give to local tribal communities to literally procure land. And so there's efforts out there that are really interesting and really cool. That's my meager effort to disrupt spaces about that issue specifically. I hope that makes sense.
It does. Jessica, do you have any thoughts on that?
I have to unmute myself. I do, but I don't want to take up, I don't want to take up any more time. I want to make sure there's got time to answer a couple more questions. from
Sure,
Greg.
yeah, why don't we go to another question? It comes from someone in New Mexico. And in New Mexico, they say we have beautiful murals telling the Camino Real Spaniard colonization story by a non-native artist. We would now like to tell the native side of the story without destroying the artwork. How might you all imagine going about that?
Man, New Mexico is so complicated because it is a border state, and so there is a lot of mixed history that's there. Yeah, I don't know. I think you'd have to talk to the people that are there that have a very specific stake in that space and what that looks like. New Mexico has got a lot of incredibly talented native artists and native muralists that would be able to handle something like that in a way that I think would be the right way to go. I don't think somebody from the outside, of which I am on the outside, my people are not from that area, would be able to inform that way better than I could. But I think, that first step of engaging native artists for something like that is the most important step in trying to figure out how that comes through. I am of the opinion that we're in a time and place right now that non-native people should not be painting native people. They should not be painting imagery or likeness of native people. They should not be doing any of the sort of historical aspects of it, because they are benefiting from our likeness, of which we don't get anything back from. And I am of the opinion that non-native artists need to stop. And that's a full stop statement. Like, there's no caveat to that whatsoever. Because we are in a place where we can tell our own stories. So speaking to native artists is going to be 100% the most important thing you can do in a situation like that, I think.
Jessica, anything to add?
I agree with that. I don't know anything about the existing murals, how long they've been there, anything along those lines. But I have personal experience with Santa Fe. I was in residency there, and I had somebody who was non-native, an executive director of an org there, call me and just really wanted me to give permission to keep using the word Indian, which I wouldn't give, and it's not my right to give anyway. I'm wondering why are the current murals why are they not wanting to be removed? Not necessarily destroyed, but I'm curious about that.
Yeah, and I think this is an interesting question that a lot of communities around the country are asking. Similar kind of question about removing, our public artworks, including monuments and memorials, right, that are created, problematic histories, and also created by people who didn't actually experience the harms of a particular history. So I think I appreciate both of your reflections on what that process could look like. And I know it very much is alive and well in public art all around the country. And I'm looking at the time, and we're right at time, and I wish we could have more time. And it's been really lovely listening to both of your stories and your perspectives. And I know we're getting a lot of thank yous from the audience. So thank you, Jessica and Greg, for being here and being so candid with all of us today. I just want to remind folks that there is this really beautiful issue of public art now that Jessica has curated, and it features Gregg's work and other artists' work. We will put that link in the chat once again. So there are other really great artists doing work, and native artists making public art, which is alive and well right now. So hope you all check that issue out. Check out and follow Jessica and Gregg's great work. Check out his TED Talk that just went live. And we will make sure that you all will get this recording so you can share it out with others. And appreciate y'all for joining us today. Thanks again, Jessica. Thanks again, Gregg.
Thank you both.
Thank you.